Hey guys, welcome back to our Science and God study. We're on week 11, the theory of evolution part 2. So today we're going to be covering a recap of evolution part 1. We're going to talk about the great cop-out. We're going to talk about the fact that the theory of evolution did originate and start with the observable. We're going to talk about the time frame of hundreds of millions to billions of years. We're going to reference the great cop-out again. You'll see why later. We're going to talk about what vestigials are. We're going to take a moment to step back from all of the terminology and definitions and just think logically. Ask some logical questions about the theory of evolution and what it claims. And then in closing, give a recap of what we have covered today and what we will be covering next week. So evolution part 1, we talked about microevolution, which is adaptation. We talked about the fact that there are different types of evolution, and knowing the distinctions between them is vitally important. So microevolution, which is adaptation, which are minor changes within a kind over a short period of time. So minor changes, it's within the same kind of creature, and it's over a short period of time. Microevolution, which I will later refer to as adaptation, it is observable and it is scientific, and it is not an issue for Christians. It's not anti-creationism or anything. Macroevolution, however, are major changes from one kind into another kind over a long period of time. This is where we get the, millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions to billions of years, and they're major changes like a fish to a cat, or a monkey to a human, or a piece of yeast, so like a single cell organism, into a fish, and so on and so forth. So these are major changes from one kind, like a canine kind, to a feline kind, so like a dog to a cat, over a long period of time. So as you can see, between microevolution and macroevolution, they are pretty much opposites. Well, not opposites, but they are just distinctly different. Then we have Darwinian evolution, which is the belief, so it's a belief, that life developed from stardust into simple-celled organisms, or single-cell organisms, I apologize, into more complex organisms over the course of hundreds of millions of years. So this is what so a change of kind, real quick. Well, when we typically say evolution nowadays, people's minds typically go straight to Darwinian evolution, which is when we see things like a monkey turning into a man. That is Darwinian evolution. Alright, so a change of kind, it's very important for us to know this. So a kind is a classification or a taxonomy of living organisms who fit into a certain classification. It is not the same thing as species. So a species is very different from a kind. So we know that we've got the canine kind, which is dogs and all of their various species, all of their various types, from wolves and so on to our domesticated house dogs. And we've got the feline kind, like we've got cats and we've got mountain lions and we've got all these other different types of felines. So those are kinds, and we've got different plants. Those would be a kind, and so on and so forth. And it's not the same thing as species. It's a broader classification. We know that species can change, and organisms' kinds can change from one species to another, but Darwinian evolution and macroevolution specifically talks about a change of kinds, and that distinction is extremely important. It's not a change of species, or it's not a change within a species. It's a change of kinds, from like a cat to a dog. Alright, so the great cop-out. Once again, like the Big Bang Theory, the theory of evolution attempts to answer a major life question without the use of faith, meaning that the theory of evolution relies on observable evidence to prove the claims of the theory of evolution. And if their evidence isn't observable, it of course isn't scientific. Meaning that we could be shown clear evidence today and believe in the theory of evolution because we can clearly see it at work. Meaning that you don't have to exercise any amount of faith, and that you don't have to accept any part of it without evidence, but that could be proven completely scientifically, and that's what it means to not rely on faith, but to rely on evidence instead. So Richard Dawkins, who is a world-renowned atheist and naturalist, said that faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate science. In other words, faith is for people who are stupid. Faith is for people who don't want to think for themselves, who just want to be told what to believe, and who will believe anything with blind faith just because they don't have the intelligence to investigate something for themselves. We will revisit this quote in a different light soon. So clearly anything that requires faith is not welcome in the scientific community. So we already found that a great deal of blind faith is required to believe the Big Bang Theory, which again is another theory that claims to be backed by scientific evidence and proof rather than faith. We found that to not be true. So it starts with the observable. So what does it mean when something is observable? So observable means we can see evidence for it today. We can actually see it at work today. In other words, we know that gravity exists because it's observable. If I hold a pencil and let go of it, it is going to fall to the floor every single time. That's why I say scientific law, because it will fall every single time, and that action is gravity at work. It is observable. A more simple explanation is I can observe. You can ask me if people jog nowadays, and I could say yes, absolutely, and you say, okay, we'll prove it with observable evidence, and then I can record somebody that I see jogging up and down the street and say, here's some observable evidence. It means it's something that you can see today and now at work as proof. It's not something that happened a long time ago that nobody saw and that nobody was there for. It means that it is here and now, and we can clearly see it. So evolution, as we think of it today, started with an observable change from one species to another. So the most common thing that people point at when they're talking about evolution, the most notable example is what's known as Darwin's finches, who underwent a change in the Galapagos. So some of us are probably already familiar with the scenario, but basically, I believe Darwin actually brought the finches to the Galapagos Islands, and he went back and visited a period of time later and noticed that the finches that he saw there were distinctly different from the finches that he originally observed on the island, or the finches that he originally brought himself, whatever the case may be. But the finches underwent visible change. The finches now, once he'd visited the second time, had beaks that were significantly and noticeably larger than the beaks of the finches that were there originally. And so they underwent a change. Now, this is adaptation, this is natural selection. So what happened on the island was the food or the fruit that was available on the island, the finches with small beaks were not able to penetrate the fruit to get the food, so they starved and they died. Since they starved and died, they weren't able to reproduce, and any offspring that they would have had would have carried the same genes of having a small beak, and so they would have died anyways. So all the small-beaked finches died off. However, the finches that just were fortunate enough to have slightly larger beaks, enough to penetrate the fruit and get to it, were able to survive, and they were able to reproduce and then pass on their genes to their offspring, so their offspring would carry the genes of having the larger beak. And so there would be a new generation of finches that would have a beak that was adapted so that it would be able to penetrate the fruit and survive, because that gene was carried on by the remaining original larger beaked finches. So this isn't a change of kind. So this isn't Darwinian evolution. This is not finches turning into rabbits because rabbits were better suited to survive on the island. It was finches who underwent a change and were still finches. So they were birds who were still birds. This is speciation, adaptation, natural selection. This is microevolution. This is change within a kind. This is not change from one kind to another. However, people point to this example as Darwinian evolution when in fact it's not. So Darwin is known as the father of evolution because he originally suggested that one kind, as we've discussed earlier, like humankind, could change into another kind. The idea that humankind could change into a different kind, like a dog, or a dog to a human, or a monkey to a human, and so on and so forth. That's why we see bumper stickers today where you can see in the upper hand corner, I'm going to adjust the camera, so please forgive me, I'll put it back there. So in the upper right hand corner we see the Jesus fish that was taken, and the name Darwin was put on the inside, and the fish was given legs, and that's a clear statement saying, I reject this idea of a creator, I reject Jesus, I reject God. Instead, I'm going to take science, which tells me that fish can walk out of the sea and grow legs, and I believe that we came from evolution and we weren't created, and so on and so forth. So it started with the observable. So the finches absolutely underwent a change. They were different when he went back. But what we find really quickly is that there is no observable evidence for Darwinian evolution. If somebody asks me if there's evidence for microevolution, I would say absolutely. There's no observable evidence for us coming from monkeys. There isn't. Observable? No. Can you speculate and say, oh, I think we did? Sure. There is no observable evidence, however that's not scientific. There is no observable evidence for one kind evolving into another. We will see that even evolutionary biology professors can't give us any observable evidence for Darwinian evolution. What they are going to point to every single time is microevolution, speciation, adaptation, which is not Darwinian evolution. Again, knowing the distinctions are extremely important. So why do so many people believe in evolution, Darwinian evolution, if there's just no evidence for it? Well, it's because people don't know the difference between a change in species and a change in kinds. So they confuse the evidence for speciation as evidence for Darwinian evolution. So somebody will point to an example of microevolution or adaptation and say, this is Darwinian evolution. And if you don't know any better, you'd say, oh wow, okay, I can see that now. It makes sense now. And then you'll try to draw the conclusions that would allow for monkeys to turn into men. You'd kind of stretch that imagination, so to speak. People accept speciation, microevolution, as evidence for Darwinian evolution just because they do not know the difference. So the time frame. So the idea of a change of kinds, which is Darwinian evolution, started with adaptation or speciation, where there are observable changes within a species, within a kind is what I mean. So after starting with the observable, speculation and theorization quickly turns to the unobservable Darwinian evolution. So Darwinian evolution takes millions and millions of years. However, microevolution can take place within an organism's lifespan. Richard Dawkins said about the time frame of evolution, we are condemned to live only for a few decades, and that's too slow. That's too small a time frame to see evolution going on. So what Richard Dawkins is saying here is if we were able to live for millions of years, of course we would see evolution going on. We'd be able to see and experience the changes. However, since we're only limited to living a few decades, we're not going to see it. Charles Darwin said, we see nothing of these slow changes in progress, meaning evolution, until the hand of time has marked the lapse of ages. So nobody's going to argue that evolution takes millions and millions of years. Nobody's going to say it doesn't. It clearly does when you're talking about Darwinian evolution. So as we said from the beginning, we need a very large time frame in order to even suggest that Darwinian evolution is a possibility. To say that something happened millions to hundreds of millions of years ago without anyone being there to observe it or record it or take data, it cannot be proven. So, even if we were to concede or acknowledge, okay, fine, Darwinian evolution, it's true, there's a change of kinds that happens over millions of years, even if we said that, we still don't have evidence for it today. Look around at all of the living organisms we know today. All living things that we know of are complete. There aren't people walking around with half-evolved legs or semi-evolved eyes. There aren't cows that have half-evolved this or half-evolved that, or humans that are in the process of transitioning from apes to men. Everything that we have, every living thing that we have on the earth is complete with all the necessary characteristics to survive. We have 2 arms, we have 2 legs, we've got 2 eyes, we've got two ears, we've got a mouth, we've got a nose, we've got many internal systems that allow us to survive. And it's the same thing with every living organism. You've got photosynthesis in plants where they are able to make their own food. We reproduce. We have the systems and all of the characteristics that are needed to survive. Nothing around is half evolved. Nothing is in the process of being half evolved or coming out of evolution. We don't see it. Everything that we know to be living is complete. So Genesis tells us that when God made all of the variety of things, that they were finished. That when God made them, they were done. That they were complete. That they weren't half done or that God was almost done with them. It says they were finished. When God made man with 2 arms and 2 legs, man was finished. So we can't see millions of years into the past. We can't. And we see no observable evidence of Darwinian evolution today. So what is it called when you believe something without seeing it? It's called faith. But faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate science, according to Richard Dawkins. So obviously people who believe in evolution, where there is no evidence, we don't see it anywhere in the world today, it's just a cop-out. They've got a tremendous amount of faith. So let's talk about vestigials. So it is suggested that there are remnants of the evolutionary process that can be seen and that show that we underwent the process of evolution. So vestigials are organs or parts of the body that are leftovers from when we were once a different living thing or a different kind that no longer serve any function in our body since we've evolved and we no longer need them. So that's what a vestigial is. So vestigials are pointed to as evidence for Darwinian evolution. They say that they are just evolutionary leftovers that we still have in our bodies because our body for some reason just didn't get rid of them. We don't need them anymore, and they came from when we were apes or some other kind of living organism. So what supposed vestigials do we have? So what useless organs do we have in our body that are just leftovers from when we evolved from being a different kind? So here are two distinct ones. So the tailbone, as it's often referred to, which is actually the coccyx vertebrae, is called that because it is believed to be the remnant of a tail that human beings supposedly once had millions of years ago. So I have that circled in the diagram to our right. However, the tailbone, which is actually the coccyx vertebrae, is not useless. It is an extremely important source of attachment for tendons, ligaments, and muscles. So it's not a useless leftover that we just have from having a tail. It's actually something that we use today. So the appendix was thought to be a vestigial because its function in the body was unknown for many, many years. Biologists, scientists didn't know what the appendix was for. They didn't know, so they just assumed that it was in our body and it was pointed to as a vestigial or a leftover. However, it was discovered that the appendix is actually part of the immune system, and it is of importance especially in fetuses and young adults. So these are organs, these are parts of our body that we still use today. So neither of these parts of the body, which are often pointed to as vestigials, neither one of these are useless leftovers of the evolutionary process. So, again, let's take a step back from talking about what a vestigial is and talking about microevolution, Darwinian evolution. Let's just ask some questions. So there are some common sense questions that can be asked in order to get people to think about whether or not the theory of evolution actually makes any sense. So some of them sound kind of silly. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Thinking about this obviously from what the theory of evolution claims to be true. So if you say the chicken came first, well, number one, where did the chicken come from? Number two, a chicken can't reproduce on its own. It would have to be a rooster and a hen to reproduce. And you can't just have a chicken to lay an egg unless the chicken was already created, fully formed. But evolution doesn't claim that anything was created, period, especially not fully formed. So you can't have the chicken before the egg. However, if you say the egg was first, the egg would have to be fertilized. What would have fertilized the egg? And before the egg was fertilized, what would have even laid the egg? Surely a fish isn't going to lay an egg that would turn to a chicken. That doesn't make any sense. A chicken would have to lay the chicken egg, and the chicken egg, which would be laid by the hen, would have to be fertilized. So you'd have to have a hen and a rooster to begin with to even reproduce a chicken. Otherwise, you don't have a chicken. So either the chicken or the egg had to have been created and finished. According to Scripture, the hen and the rooster would have been created and finished and told to reproduce according to their kind, as we see evidence for today. Because guess what? We have chickens and roosters. And they provide us with delicious, healthy, nutritious food, just as God intended. So we supposedly came from the sea, then walked out of the sea onto the land. So, question, did we have lungs or gills? If you say, okay, well, we lived in the sea, so obviously we would have to have gills so that we could breathe underwater. So the second that we walked out of the sea, we would have suffocated, because if you take a fish out of water, it suffocates. If you say, okay, well then when we walked on land, we would have to have lungs. But before we got to the land, if we had lungs, we would have drowned in the water right away. So the only explanation for a fish walking out onto land is if the fish went immediately from having gills to having lungs in the snap of a finger, in a matter of seconds or in the matter of minutes. However, Darwinian evolution doesn't claim that these processes happen within that short a time frame. It talks about millions of years, but obviously a fish isn't going to take millions of years to walk out onto the land. It doesn't work. It logically does not make sense. So here's some more questions. How did our bodies know to make eyes before we could see? How did our body know to make a brain before we could think to make the brain? How would our body know to make ears before we knew what hearing was in order for us to even need ears? Which came first? Which evolved first, the blood or the heart? If you say the blood evolved first, well, there's nothing to pump the blood around the body, so the blood wouldn't serve its purpose and it would just be stagnant in the body. If you say, okay, well then the heart must have evolved first, well, why do you need a heart if there's no blood to pump around the body? They would have to be created or come in our body at the same time in order to work in the way that they work today. So there's just some logical questions, and there's many, many more. It's just put a common sense approach to what the theory of evolution claims, and you're going to find that it just doesn't make sense and it can't happen. So in closing, we have a few more important things that we're going to cover next week, but we're going to include them in week 3 of the theory of evolution. So at the end of the day, there's not observable evidence for Darwinian evolution. People confuse adaptation, speciation, microevolution, natural selection for Darwinian evolution. They say they're the same thing, and they're very much not. We talked about the distinction between the two, or between them. So the living things that we see today, they're complete. They are finished. They're not half-evolved. We don't see half-evolved cows in a field or half-evolved sheep. I don't have a half-evolved cat for a pet. I don't see half-evolved humans walking around. Everything is complete with the necessary organs and biological systems to survive. So asking logical questions about the order of things can open up our thinking about whether or not Darwinian evolution makes sense. Ask people these questions who believe in evolution and see what they can come up with. So we can't observe millions of years ago, just like we couldn't when we talked about the theory of the Big Bang Theory. So all evolutionists can do is make their best guess to try to fill in the gaps of time between when we were dust on a star that was supposedly alive to where we are today. Same thing with the Big Bang Theory. Scientists have to try to fill in the gaps because it's unobservable. They try to fill in the gaps between when time and space began to where we are today and try to make the most sense of it in the time between. They both function very much the same way. They both try to answer life questions using science and data versus faith, but they both rely on blind faith completely. So next week we will talk about what DNA tells us, the implications of Darwinian evolution, and we will close out our study on evolution by watching a video. Thank you guys very much for taking the time to watch this video. I hope you got something out of it. Ask questions if you have them. Do your own research for more information. There's only so much that I can cover. There's only so much that I know about. And again, I'm just doing my research, so you do your research, and I'm sure you can come up with a lot of good stuff to add to this series. God bless you guys for watching it. Have a great week, and I can't wait to see you guys on Sunday.